What if the most dangerous conflict of the 21st century isn't really about trade deficits, Taiwan, or technology theft? What if it's actually a war that ended 160 years ago and never really stopped? Because while Western analysts keep trying to explain the US-China rivalry through the lens of economics and military competition, Chinese leaders are operating from a completely different script, one written in the 1840s, one soaked in humiliation, rage, and a determination that what happened then will never, ever happen again. The Opium Wars didn't just cost China territory and money, they destroyed something far more important. They shattered the foundational belief of an entire civilization. The belief that China was the center of the world, the most advanced society on Earth, the Middle Kingdom that other nations naturally looked up to. And every tension in US-China relations today, every trade dispute, every technology restriction, every Taiwan crisis can be traced back to a British ship sailing into Chinese waters carrying opium in 1839. Let's go back to when the world changed. The world before the Opium Wars. To understand what the Opium Wars destroyed, you first need to understand what China was before them. In 1800, China was still the world's largest economy. It produced roughly 33% of total global GDP. The Qing dynasty ruled over 300 million people, the largest population on Earth. Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea were luxury goods that Europeans desperately wanted. The problem? China didn't want much from Europe in return. Chinese officials famously told British trade delegations that China had everything it needed and required nothing from the Western barbarians. This wasn't arrogance without basis. Chinese civilization had been producing world-class philosophy, technology, and art for 3,000 years. They had invented paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass. The Chinese tributary system had organized Asian international relations for 2,000 years. Chinese emperors genuinely were the most powerful rulers on the planet for most of recorded history. The result was a massive trade imbalance. British merchants were buying enormous quantities of Chinese goods, but China wasn't buying British goods. Silver was flowing from Europe to China at a rate that was draining Western treasuries. The British East India Company needed to fix this imbalance, and their solution was despicable, calculated, and devastatingly effective. Opium. The most evil business plan in history. British colonial India produced opium in massive quantities. The East India Company had perfected cultivation in Bengal. They had the supply. They just needed a market. China became that market. Starting in the late 1700s, British merchants began illegally smuggling opium into China. The Qing government had banned opium sales and consumption, but British ships, operating under the protection of the Crown, ignored Chinese law and kept selling. The scale of this operation is almost incomprehensible. By the 1830s, approximately 30,000 chests of opium, each weighing 140 pounds, were being smuggled into China annually. That's over 2,000 tons of pure opium every year. The social destruction was catastrophic. An estimated 10 to 12 million Chinese became addicted. Government officials, soldiers, merchants, farmers, entire social classes were being destroyed by addiction. Tax revenues collapsed, military readiness deteriorated, social order broke down. And now the trade deficit was reversed. Silver was flowing out of China to pay for opium. China's economy was being systematically hollowed out to enrich British merchants and balance British trade accounts. This was not an accident. This was policy. The British government knew exactly what was happening. They were deliberately addicting millions of Chinese people to fund their trade with China. The moral bankruptcy of this is almost beyond description. In 1839, Chinese Emperor Daoguang had enough. He appointed Lin Zexu as special commissioner to end the opium trade. Lin Zexu confiscated and destroyed 1,400 tons of British opium in Canton. He wrote a remarkable letter to Queen Victoria appealing to her morality, asking how Britain could inflict such suffering on China when they would never tolerate opium addiction in their own country. Queen Victoria never responded. Instead, Britain sent gunboats. The psychological foundation of Xi Jinping's foreign policy. Xi Jinping has been more explicit than any Chinese leader since Mao about connecting current policy to the century of humiliation narrative. His concept of the Chinese dream is explicitly defined as national rejuvenation, recovery from the century of humiliation, restoration of China's historical greatness. His five no's for foreign policy include no hegemony, power politics, or Cold War mentality, language directly addressing the behaviors of Western powers during the Opium Wars era. His aggressive posture on territorial disputes, his refusal to accept Western criticism on Hong Kong and Xinjiang, his resistance to American pressure on economic practices, all of it is framed domestically through the lens of ensuring China never again accepts external impositions. The Chinese Communist Party's foundational legitimacy is built on this narrative. The nationalists failed to end the century of humiliation. The communists succeeded. Mao drove out foreign powers. Deng Xiaoping rebuilt Chinese economic strength. Xi Jinping is completing national rejuvenation. Any concession to American pressure is politically dangerous domestically because it echoes the Qing dynasty signing unequal treaties under foreign pressure. It risks the accusation that current leaders are repeating the weakness of the emperors who surrendered Chinese sovereignty in the 1840s. This is why negotiations with China are so difficult. American negotiators see practical deal-making. Chinese negotiators see historical pattern recognition. When America pushes hard on trade practices or technology transfer, they see economic diplomacy. Chinese leaders see the latest version of forcing open Chinese markets with implicit threats, exactly what Britain did before the Opium Wars. What this means for the next decade. Understanding the Opium Wars context doesn't make US-China tensions easier to resolve. In some ways, it makes them harder, because it reveals that we're not primarily dealing with a trade dispute or a military competition. We're dealing with a civilizational wound that is still actively inflaming Chinese strategic behavior. America can negotiate trade deals. They can establish military hotlines. They can build economic relationships. But they can't address 180 years of historical trauma through diplomatic frameworks that don't acknowledge that trauma exists. Chinese leaders will interpret American pressure through the century of humiliation lens, regardless of American intentions. Every semiconductor restriction will be seen as an unequal treaty. Every Taiwan arms sale will be seen as foreign powers maintaining Chinese division. Every human rights criticism will be seen as Western civilization, claiming the right to judge Chinese governance. Just as British officials claimed the right to override Chinese law during the Opium Wars. This doesn't mean America should stop defending its interests. It means American policymakers need to understand what they're actually dealing with, not a strategic competitor making rational calculations about power and interest, but a civilization that experienced the most profound humiliation in its 5,000-year history and has organized its entire political project around ensuring it never happens again. That civilization now has nuclear weapons, the world's largest economy, and a military modernizing faster than any since the Soviet Union. And it's led by a man who explicitly frames his mission as completing the recovery from the century of humiliation. That is a more dangerous and complex challenge than most American strategic thinking acknowledges. The poison that never left the system. So how do the Opium Wars still poison US-China relations today? They poison them by creating a Chinese leadership class that processes every American action through a lens of civilizational humiliation and historical pattern recognition. They poison them by giving Chinese leaders domestic political incentives to resist American pressure regardless of the merits, because concession echoes the Qing dynasty's capitulation. They poison them by creating a genuine Chinese belief that Western-led international institutions, from the World Bank to the WTO to the human rights system, are continuations of the unequal treaty system with better marketing. They poison them by making Taiwan not just a strategic issue, but an emotionally loaded symbol of whether the century of humiliation has truly ended. They poison them by giving China a powerful ideological alternative to offer the developing world. We know what Western colonialism feels like, and we're building something different. And they poison them by creating in Chinese strategic thinking a determination that technological and military power must be maintained at all costs, because it was technological superiority that allowed the British to force open China in 1839, and only technological parity or superiority will ensure it never happens again. Lin Zexu wrote to Queen Victoria in 1839, appealing to her sense of justice. She didn't respond. They sent gunboats instead. Chinese leaders remember, they will always remember. And until American policymakers understand that they're not dealing with a trade partner seeking better terms, but a civilization seeking to ensure the worst chapter of its history never repeats, they will keep being surprised by Chinese behavior that seems irrational from a purely strategic perspective, but makes perfect sense from a historical one. The Opium Wars ended in 1860. They haven't stopped shaping the world, and they won't stop until China feels secure that the century of humiliation is genuinely over. Not just in economic statistics, not just in military capability, but in the fundamental recognition from the rest of the world that China is a sovereign equal whose core interests cannot be violated by outside powers. We're not there yet. We may not be there for decades. And that gap between where we are and where China needs to be to feel secure, that's the most dangerous space in modern geopolitics. That's the poison the Opium Wars left in the system, and it's still spreading. Click on the video on your screen now to keep watching. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and see you in the next one.